I think that Professor Hamid Dabashi needs no introduction here since we are all sitting here to celebrate the publication of his book. But nevertheless, I'm going to briefly summarize, to the best of my ability, a very wide-ranging and illustrious career. He serves as the Jacob Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature in Misas here at Columbia. And he's written more than 24 books, edited 4, and contributed chapters to many more. He's also the author of over 100 essays, articles, and book reviews on a variety of subjects. And his books and articles have been translated into numerous languages. And I thought it was striking enough to take a second to list them all because it demonstrates the worldwide reach of some of Professor Dabashi's work. It's been translated into Japanese, German, French, Spanish, Danish, Russian, Hebrew, Italian, Arabic, Korean, Persian, Portuguese, Polish, Turkish, Urdu, and Catalan, which is that's it. So needless to say, if I were to take some time to kind of walk through each and every one of his books this evening by way of introduction, I think we would spend the rest of our time doing so. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the recurrent themes of his research, both to trace the connective threads, but also to appreciate the diversity of fields to which he is contributing. Most obviously Iranian studies and comparative literature, but also Islamic philosophy, film studies in Iran and Palestine, the Shahnameh and epic more broadly, the legacies of Edward Said, Persian literature and culture broadly defined, but also in conversation with questions of world history, Shiism, postcolonialism, travel narratives, and I think I could just keep on going here even as well. So suffice to say that the summary should demonstrate that the book we're here to discuss tonight, The Persian Prince, grows out of an interest that crosses disciplines and chronologies. So one more thing very briefly by way of introduction is that Professor Dabashi has successfully brought many of these topics to life for the students here at Columbia. So he teaches very popular courses such as The Game of Thrones, and last year was recognized for yet another one of his books by the students themselves. So I'm going to briefly, quickly introduce each of the panelists so you know who's speaking and we can have the introductions done at first. So our first response is from Professor Debashri Mukherjee, also from the Misas department. She is a scholar of film and media, specializing in modern mass media forms produced in South Asia and its diasporas. Her work draws methodological insights from film and media studies, feminist decolonial historiography, and environmental humanities. So her first monograph, Bombay Hustle, was published in 2020. It approaches cinema in late colonial Bombay as an ecology of energy relations that connect studio and screen. Bombay Hustle was awarded an honorable mention for the Modernist Studies Association First Book Prize in 2021 and commended for the Krasner-Krauss Moving Image Book Award and Richard Wall Memorial Award. Professor Mukherjee is currently working on a very promising and ambitious second book that presents a media history of indentured labor and plantation capitalism spanning photography, communications infrastructures, and film traffic across Mauritius, Fiji, and the Andaman Islands. Our second response will come from Pier Mattia Tomasino, an associate professor in the Italian department, associate editor of Romanic Review, and founder of the Italian Mediterranean Colloquium. He explores the generative contact between the Italian peninsula and the Muslim world from the 14th through the early 18th centuries, focusing specifically on linguistic, textual, bibliographical, and religious relations between Southern Europe and the Muslim world. And in particular, he works on the Italian and Latin translations of the Quran, as well as on the diffusion of Italian language books in the Muslim Mediterranean. His first book is The Venetian Quran, published in Italian in 2013, and then translated into English in 2018. And he's currently finishing his second monograph entitled Court Voices, Courtly Texts, 5 Observations of Late Medici Orientalism. Relevant to this evening's conversation, he has also published articles in a book chapter related to the study of Machiavelli, Islam, and the East. And our final response tonight will come from our visitor, so welcome. Professor Firuze Kashanisabet is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She's published a number of books about the 19th and 20th centuries, an impressive combination, particularly when seen alongside both her fictional work and her poetry. Her first book, Frontier Fictions, analyzes the significance of land and border disputes to the process of identity and nation formation, as well as to cultural production in Iran and its borderlands. She has also worked extensively on the histories of disease, science, and reproductive politics, including, in particular, her book, Conceiving Citizens, which received the 2012 Book Award from the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. Her most recent book, Heroes to Hostages, draws on sources in Persian and English to analyze the ties between America and Iran, not only through international diplomacy, but also through cultural and social history with a focus on race, gender, and ethnic relations. So thank you for joining us, and I'd hope to get started with an overview from Professor Dabashi on his recent book.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. First and foremost, my gratitude to all of you to come in a rainy day in what I believe to be the most inhospitable building on Columbia campus. Not that the rest of Columbia is very hospitable, but the designers of this building made sure that nobody can show up. I'm very grateful. Bob, Joseph, Marina, Megan, all of you, Kai, my buddy. Equally grateful I am to my distinguished colleagues. A particular note of congratulation to my colleague Debashri Mukherjee, who just graced Columbia University with being tenured, namely she tenured Columbia and honored Columbia, not the other way around. We are heartfelt congratulations. Now, the story of this book, as I have said a few times, goes back to my days as a graduate student when I first read the English translation of The Prince. I had read the Persian translation earlier. And as I usually do when I read a book like this, is what it has to do with me. This Italian guy wrote about Prince, what it has to do with us. So I began in my mind to think of what text in Arabic and Persian would be equivalent of Machiavelli. So obvious texts come to mind: Nasiruddin Tusi, Nizam al-Mulk, Ghazali's Nasihat al-Muluk, etc. But then I still did not have a book. I only had a book when I read Gramsci. Gramsci's, one of the things in the prison notebooks is his book, The Modern Prince, in which he argues that if we were to have the Machiavellian prince nowadays, this is back in the time that he is in Mussolini's jail, writing prison notebooks, it would be the political party. And at this point, I thought I had a book, and it said, Brother Gramsci, I take it from here. It's not going to be political party, it's something else. So the book is in fact divided between two sections. One section is Machiavelli going back to the sources of Machiavelli, namely beginning with Xenophon's Cyropedia, coming all the way through Latin sources. But equally important for me was the Hebrew Bible, particularly the book of Esther, in which the figure of the prince, whether it's the character of Ahasuerus or Cyrus, that was anointed in the Hebrew Bible. But equally important was the material produced in Judeo-Persian in the 14th century by this poet from Shiraz, his name was Shirazi, who began to recast the Pentateuch in Persian epic poetry. So this is happening all the way sort of south or north of Machiavelli. But then the material as the archetype of the Persian prince is taking shape, of course, does not come only from Greek sources and Hebrew sources. The primary sources are sources that are produced in Arabic and in Persian, in the genre of Al-Mawardi's Ahkam Sultaniya, or in the genre of Nasihat al-Muluk of Ghazali, or in the genre of all of these mirrors for princes that happen both in Persian and in Arabic, and they have been studied, that I was particularly attentive to the Persian sources. But then there is another source, which is pre-Islamic Pahlavi sources. The chief example of that is Khuday Namak, that was translated from Pahlavi into Arabic by Ibn al-Mughaffa. And Ibn al-Mughaffa has this very seminal role that he plays that eventually reaches Ferdowsi and turns into Shahnameh. But these are pre-Islamic Iranian sources. There are other sources that is evident in Ibn Mughaffa's translation of Panchatantra that was translated from Sanskrit into Pahlavi during the Sassanid period. Anushiravan was available to Ibn Mughaffa, and Ibn Mughaffa turned it into one of the most magnificent literary sources in the entire Arabic literature, namely Qilila wa Dimna. Qilila wa Dimna is a rendition of Ibn Mughaffa of Panchatantra and aspects of Mahabharata that then from the Arabic it disseminates in the Mediterranean world into Latin and Spanish and other sources. There is only one or two sources before and other than Ibn Mughaffa in Syriac by an Iranian a Nestorian priest that had translated it from Pahlavi into Syriac. At any rate, so this, as I'm constructing the archetype, you have Indian sources, you have pre-Islamic Iranian sources, you have Greek sources, and you have Hebrew Bible, biblical sources. But from the Roman period forward, manifestations of this figure of the Persian prince appears in art, in operas, and in music, such as Handel's Xerxes, for example. So they have a character of the Persian prince that has this widespread reception in European literary and artistic and operatic and musical sense. So to make a long story short, this kind of comes together to build the character, the idea, and qualifications of Persian prince. And as I say repeatedly in the book, I use the word prince, which in Persian would be Shahriyar, as a persona and not as a person. So it is not, and also, as you know, in Persian, we don't have gender-specific pronouns. So it's not a prince as opposed to a princess. And also Persian in the sense of an archetype, because the Persian prince is as much Arabic, as much Indian, as Turkish and Armenian and what have you. So I make a big thing out of this. Then it comes sort of post-Gramsci, namely what happens to the idea of the Persian prince in the encounter with European colonial modernity. And here I argue that, sort of borrowing from Gramsci, that you have the formation of a colonial/post-colonial public sphere in which the formative forces of the prince implode into four subcategories, which I call them the poet, the prophet, the rebel, and the pilgrim. So there are the four. My argument is that these sub-archetypal forces were already evident in the category, but under the pressure of colonialism and collapse of the figure of the prince, which is no longer legitimate, these subcategories emerge. So a lot of attention is paid to post-16th century poetry and prose and the formation of revolutionary figures, that these revolutionary figures across the Islamic world and the Iranian world, from Khorasan all the way to the Mediterranean, that these revolutionary figures and these rebels, the source of the legitimacy is borrowing from the collapse of that imperial category. So that brings me all the way to contemporary times. I think I did it fairly well, Alison, right? That today, in order for us to understand colonial/post-colonial/decolonial political culture of the region influenced by the idea of the prince, in the way that I have constructed it, we can no longer look to the figure of a monarch. The monarch has lost that legitimacy, and so has the patriarch. But you have to look at poets, prophetic voices, and revolutionary rebels who borrow from that category. And I give examples of them. And ultimately, the figure of the pilgrim that I think is crucial. So that's the book in a nutshell. But still, you have to read it to believe it. Thanks, Anna.
Okay. So in a bit, I will need this. Okay, so thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much, Hamid. It's a real honor to be here at this table with all of you, and a privilege to be engaging with this really magnificent book. I am a scholar of film and media studies, so you're going to see how I'm going to enter into the book through that space. So to begin, in the 2023 film American Fiction, the protagonist is a writer and a professor, an African-American man named Thelonious Monk Ellison, who is frustrated by the fact that no one seems to want his latest novel. This novel is a reworking of Aeschylus's tragic drama, The Persians, and publishers would rather that Monk wrote a properly Black book. Now, Aeschylus is very much present in Professor Dabashi's hugely ambitious new book, The Persian Prince, but there is more to the comparison with American Fiction than just that. Dabashi has also written an improper book. It is not properly Iranian, it is not properly American, it is not even properly post-colonial. Allow me to explain. Dabashi is not interested in telling a story of nations and nationalisms, nor is he interested in making easy gestures about decolonial authenticities. Both gestures, at least as they play out in large sections of the US Academy today, make our ideas vulnerable to nativist appropriations, to dangerous reinforcements of borders between us and them, those who came before and those who will always be too late. And this, I think, is the ambition and the gift of the book. It takes the idea and the historical person and persona of the Persian prince and launches a dizzying tour of multiple millennia as this figure morphs into an archetype that fundamentally disturbs what many identify as the key epistemic break of modernity, which is the production and the violent consolidation of binaries such as man, woman, east, west, nature, culture, Hindu, Muslim, and so on. So this figure, the Persian prince, transgresses these boundaries and shows us that which is Persian in Europe, that which is Islamic in Christian theories of rule, and that which is poetic in politics. As a scholar of film and media, I'm particularly appreciative of Dabashi's nimble, fleet-footed pursuit of the Persian prince as an imaginative trope and as a traveling archetype. Circulation is a key method and subject of the book, as is the investment in culture. Here, culture and cultural expression are non-hierarchical, as we move from princely political treatises to Hollywood action films, to art cinema, to Sufi poetry. Popular culture, which is one of my long-standing areas of interest, becomes an important archive for Dabashi because of his framing questions. What do we gain if we track the public and the para-public manifestations of the modern prince? This question necessitates a turn to culture as well as history, as the prince weaves in and out of deep veins of cultural memory. As a Bengali, I am undoubtedly, even though I'm an itinerant pseudo-Bengali, I'm undoubtedly part of the Persian cosmopolis that Dabashi opens up. And he's opened it up since at least the early 2010s with the book Persian Literary Humanism. Again, my understanding of this location came to me from the movies. Watching auteurist Iranian cinema in film festivals in New Delhi, I was struck by a sense of linguistic familiarity because so much of everyday Bengali is composed of Persian words. But the term Persian cosmopolis gestures to much more. It is an epic project of world-making, albeit an imperial project, but one that produced what Dabashi calls a cosmopolitan worldliness. Now, there are those who have adopted terms such as Islamicate and Persianate to get to this space of cosmopolitan worldliness. And there is an excellent section in the book that parses the possibilities and limitations of these terms, specifically as they apply to those of us that do South Asian studies in whatever form. The Islamicate, for example, has been mobilized by scholars of Indian cinema to thematize the recurrence of aesthetic, architectural, and poetic modes of North Indian Muslim life in Bombay cinema. Recently, in a special issue of a journal that I edit, Bioscope South Asian Screen Studies, my colleague Salma Siddique politicizes this use by suggesting that unlike Pakistani scholars of, say, Lahore cinema, it is only the Indian post-colonial scholars who feel compelled to trace the Islamicate. And this is because of the very real Islamophobic takeover of everyday politics and culture in contemporary India. Now, Dabashi, in consonance with Richard Eaton, suggests that we need to move beyond the casting of Indian history solely in Hindu-Muslim terms. So the idea of a Persianate world or Persian cosmopolis might prove a promising conceptual key for understanding pre-modern South Asian history on its own terms, and indeed for rescuing both Iranian and Indian history from the steel grip of nationalist historiographies. And this is a quote from Richard Eaton in this book. So here is one place where I think I can legitimately discuss the productive power of the Persian Prince. A Persian cosmopolitical read on the emergence of cinema in India becomes crucial in this political moment. As a concept that long predates all these anxieties of ethno-nationalism, as Dabashi puts it, the term Persian and the figure of the Persian prince are particularly useful to trace across geographies and across borders. Spanning the lands of the Balkans to Bengal, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia to India, the Persianate is a polyvocal, polylocal, and polyfocal thought space for Dabashi. So here I want to ventriloquize some arguments made by another colleague, Rosie Thomas, to ask, what if India's first celluloid hero was not a noble Hindu king from the epic Mahabharata, but a dutiful prince from a Persian dastan? My reference here is to the first all-India super hit film, Gule Bakavali, which released in 1924 in Bombay City, after more than a century of translation and adaptation in the subcontinent. The film itself was a fantasy story, a tale of quest and adventure that captivated Indian audiences and launched the careers of India's first talkie film actress and the first Indian female film director. This is a mother-daughter duo of Fatima Begum and Zubaida. Now, Rosie Thomas has argued that this kind of an history, which for her is Islamicate, but I think now more productively understood as Persianate, has implications for writing a film historiography beyond nationalism. So rather than beginning with a 40-minute Hindu myth, Indian cinema history might kick off with a 2-hour, confusingly culturally hybrid story set within an Islamic fantasy world and keying into global Orientalist obsessions at the high point of a cosmopolitan modernity. Crucially, such a history would stress Indian cinema's interconnectedness with world cinema and culture rather than its supposed exotic difference. Now, the story of Gule Bakavali is based on a Persian kissa, and it tells the tale of a fairy, a pari, Bakavali. She has a divine flower in her possession, gul, flower, which is known for its healing powers, and a Persian prince, Taj ul Mulk, who wants the flower to cure his blind father, the blind father king. The provenance of the tale and its entry into India varies, and most sources now agree that it enters into circulation in the Indian subcontinent at the turn of the 19th century. Now, the story was immensely popular on the Parsi stage, and here are some interesting Tamil language adaptations from much later, the 1950s. But it was very popular at the turn of the century in the Urdu Gujarati urban theatre form, Parsi theatre, which was created by Bombay City Zoroastrian elites. Apparently, the most popular scenes were action scenes where the Prince Taj ul Mulk faces his villainous brothers who steal the magic flower as the fairy, the pari, is turned into stone. Now, this is very important to think because alongside this is Indian cinema's origin story, where the real originary figure is the righteous Hindu king Raja Harishchandra. Now, what we forget in this origin story is that both Taj ul Mulk and Raja Harishchandra were hugely popular at the time on the Bombay theatre scene, and both drew large crowds. Their models of righteous masculinity and governance are varied, where Harishchandra gambles away his kingdom, his subjects, even his family. Taj ul Mulk sets off on a quest to retrieve this magic flower. Both are on quests to restore something cherished, be it family and kingdom, or be it the body of the king itself. There are didactic lessons in leadership here, and definitely Raja Harishchandra is also popularly read as an archetype of an ideal man, a righteous king. But in colonial India, and here again I'm thinking with Hamid's book, Both heroes also speak to other aspirations for a freedom from colonial rule through visions of alternate models of rule or of the struggle, as in Gule Bakavali, to restore a rightful regime to an usurped land, to return the questing prince back to his kingdom. So here is my first question for Professor Dabashi. There are two trajectories along which you track the Persian prince in this book. One, a model of righteous governance and political authority, an ethical model for future kings, indeed for all man. And two, there is a suggestion that we might understand something about the nature of political subject formation, even subjection, as we marvel at the ability of, say, Osiris to turn so many thousands across far-flung lands to become his willing subjects. So what is the salience of the Persian prince in 2024, and where can we find his dispersed nomadic presence? As Narendra Modi readies for a third re-election, he has very deliberately modeled himself on the figure of Ram, the perfect man, Maryada Purushottam, the ideal king, son, husband, and brother. The mobilization of Ram here is towards building a Hindu nation that will be helmed by a Hindu king. In the United States, we have Donald Trump, also modeling himself as Christ, the Son of Man, the King of Kings. Here, the mobilization is towards a white Christian nation. So what happens to the Persian prince in the face of these ethno-nationalist and masculinist political projects? Is he sublimated, to use your term, into a myriad allegorical forms? Where can we find this rebel poet in this era of right-wing populisms? Is he a trickster and a yar, an organic intellectual? Can he be detected in a Gramscian sense in new forms of collective politics, perhaps not as an individual figure? Or is this a promise that can only be found in cultural works? And if I may be allowed a second quick question. Your theorization of the Persian prince is as an archetypal figure that is gender fluid and unpin-downable in every sense. But still there is something specific about the princely Shahzada that is not historically available to real or literary figures marked female, in Urdu, the Shahzadi. So here I want to return to Gule Bakavali and the trope of the pari or the fairy, which is surely one of the most beloved fictive species to have entered South Asia from its own west. The pari is a powerful figure who can aid the prince, but also inspire her own subjects with kindness and righteousness. And I'm thinking also of Sabz Pari in the drama Inder Sabha, who has been written into the archive of cinema and cultural memory by the last Nawab of Lucknow, Wajid Ali Shah. What would we learn if we track the Persian pari through time? So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to read and to discuss the book with Hamid and all of you. I will not start from Machiavelli. I will start from your use of Gramsci, because we are in front of a creative reading of a reading. And this is what becomes the central tool for you then to, as you said, to read Machiavelli. So as a historian of reading, this was very interesting, the fact that you use Gramsci and especially and discuss not, for example, cultural hegemony, but more the concept of prince and then the organic intellectual, to return then to Machiavelli. So that was your tool, but also is a tool to be transhistorical. So that's your tool of reading central, even though then you change, with to Cassirer and Braidotti. But instead, I think to start from Machiavelli, I think it's important to start from your own acquisition of a reading to restart reading Machiavelli. And returning to Machiavelli. So then this creates the possibility to return to a metaphor or a persona or an archetype. And then this allowed, I think, you to to use this longue durée and to be trans-historical. In reading Machiavelli, what I found very interesting, I think, is also the possibility to historicize not only his use of Cyrus, that actually was a figure that was even before Machiavelli, with Dante, the Monarchia, Purgatorio, but in Petrarch and in Boccaccio, very present, but also to historicize the presence of princes, Asian princes, rulers, and Muslim princes in Italian medieval, but especially humanistic historiography. Why I'm saying this? Because and also the figure of Muhammad. If we look at what was written before Machiavelli, and we look at religious polemics, of course, we have fierce attack against Muslims and Muhammad in particular. But if you look at book of history and political thought, we have a sort of beginning from medieval universal history, but then especially in the De Viris Illustribus, the beginning of the textual and also visual narratives of princes and rulers. That will then bring not to Machiavelli, but to Paolo Giovio, and then to this depiction of Shah Ismail, that is actually a copy by Cristoforo dell'Altissimo of the Museo by Paolo Giovio. So Machiavelli arrives in a moment in which also there is a decent long tradition of start thinking of Muslims rulers, not as Muslims, but as rulers. In this case, also Persian rulers. And what is interesting, if we historicize this, is then that after Machiavelli is used to depict, for example, Muhammad as a ruler that used religion as a political tool. But in your book, what is important is, and now there is a sort of debate, especially in recent years, about the Machiavelli use of Xenophon and which kind of text he used, if in Latin or in Italian and so on. But then that brings especially the Ottomans in relation to the ancient rulers. This is important because of, for example, in your book, you use this on archetype, but also shift a little bit the focus from other uses by Machiavelli of the Ottomans, because he defines the Ottomans and compare the Ottomans with the French ruler as moderns. So we can read the Ottomans through Xenophon's lens, but also I think in Machiavelli, what is very interesting is that he treats the Ottoman as modern rulers. So not with the models of the past. In some chapter he does, but in other chapter as modern rulers. And this is happening, so we don't have necessarily to look at his ancient sources, but at what contemporary historians are writing about these new rulers. For example, Andrea Cambini was a contemporary of Machiavelli, writes a treatise on Ottomans and one on France. So that's very interesting, I think. So there are kind of two lines of studies, and the one that return to Xenophon's, put together the Ottoman and Xenophon's, but also, for example, in the line of Federico Chabot, but other studies claim that actually Machiavelli treats the Ottomans in as modern rulers and not in the frame of Asian rulers. So that's, I think, quite interesting. But then the book has different steps and stages, and so arrived then to the post-human and humanistic, and so I will have question about that more. But what is, I think, very interesting in this book, that you use the longue durée, but you don't do a sort of genealogy of a discourse. No, it's not genealogical, a book, but on the contrary, is a sort of descriptions, as you said, is descriptive of many metamorphoses. I think metamorphosis is one of the crucial words in the book, and I wonder why you didn't use it in the subtitle. But I think it's crucial, and it's crucial. You use it in many ways. You use a conceptual chameleon, you say metamorphic character, and so on. So it's a, and perhaps, I don't know if it's related to Braidotti's scholarship or not, but so, and in this metamorphosis, there is also your own evolution as a scholar. So what is very interesting in reading this book is that you continuously refer to the evolution of your thoughts. And in that sense, now arrive my question. So you return to your many books, but especially you return to the 2012 book on humanism, no? And there, of course, making a tribute to George Makdisi and so on. So your professor, that was a very important scholar also for humanism and democratic criticism by Said, you know, that is returned to Makdisi, and especially for the history of university and Arab Adab and so on. But from there, then you arrive through Rosi Braidotti to the post-human, right? So I would like to learn more about this evolution, and also about, in the conclusion, your use of mysticism and mystical poetry to define then the post-human and the let's say the relation between the self and the world and so on. So you start using then mystical poetry in that sense. So my question is about to know more about this evolution, but also to try to understand what is the agency of this post-human self, because you give a lot of agency to the rebel, to the poet, and so on, but at the same time we have a dissolvement of the self in the world. No? So I would like to know more about this, your evolution, your use of mysticism in the dissolvement of the self, but at the same time, what is the agency of this new subject? Because then, and is this agency humanistic or not? No?
So, thank you very much. I just want to say that I tried to print my comments, but my printer broke. So that's why the phone is in front of me. And I won't read entirely, but I just wanted to make that clear that I had a technical problem. First of all, thank you so much for including me in this very fascinating and exciting conversation about Professor Dabashi's latest book. I also want to say that I am one of his students, and there is a trope that he doesn't actually mention, and that's the academic prince, and one who is generous, erudite, paternal but not paternalistic, which is very hard to do. So I did want to kind of preface it by first mentioning the relationship, but also, my read of this book, perhaps because of that background as well. So Professor Dabashi has delivered a rich and imaginative study of why the archetype of a Persian prince matters, despite the demise of the Persian monarchy as an institution at this time and the gasping pleas of the Persian prince in exile. The work presents as both a literary and philosophical study of kingship in Iran and its surrounding areas. Dabashi problematizes the notion of the prince as an archetype, as a heuristic device, an ideal ruler whose philosophy of government is shaped not just by tradition, but also by religious practice and culture. As with his other publications, which have been referenced here, and I love the book on humanism as well, as you know, Professor Dabashi provides a deep reading of Persian classics and other classics that inform the subject and offers depictions of kings and princes over the longue durée. Although he transforms the Persian prince into a chameleon with multi-ethnic parentage, the prince nonetheless remains Persian, I argue. He sees the figure of the Persian prince immortalized not only in the works of Greeks, but also in the religious texts and traditions of Zoroastrians, Hindus, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The modern manifestation of the Persian prince appears in films, as we just saw, and contemporary pop culture, making it relevant as an idea today. Professor Dabashi lays out the philosophical underpinnings of the Persian Prince and its Orientalist reconstruction in multiple contexts. He juxtaposes Machiavelli's troubling prince against a protean Persian prince. You called it something else, but I call it the protean Persian prince, who bridges the pre-Islamic and Islamic cultures of governance. He brings to light a particular moment of encounter in the early modern era of what we now call the Middle East, before imperial competition gave way to colonial rule. He shows how the stately portraits of kings that hang in the Uffizi represent a shared iconography. Cristofano dell'Altissimo, who painted portraits of the Medicis, also produced portraits of two Safavid monarchs, I learned in this book. Altissimo emerged a generation after Machiavelli, and in this work, the princes of Europe and the Middle East become thus intertwined. Dabashi argues that the Italian literati were thus well aware of the Persian traditions of kingship and linked the Safavids to the monarchs of antiquity. And so several chapters consider the Machiavellian notion of absolute power and its transmutation in the works of Gramsci, whose modern prince participates in the formation of national will and power. Dabashi argues that all these conversations about the European prince take root fundamentally in Xenophon's original analysis of Cyrus, the primordial Persian prince. It is, however, in poetry that the Persian prince finds his most enduring life. Dabashi points out that Sa'di's name honors his princely patronage. Through his prince, Sa'di develops a princely soul reflected in the first section of his Bustan. From there, Dabashi traverses the rich historical landscape of what is called the Persianate, which appears in expansive spaces and then assumes transnational identities over time. Poets from Iran and other homelands invoke the Persian prince through their literary output. The Persian prince no longer remains gender specific, but instead assumes the seemingly neutered gender of rebel. The Persian Prince, the book, opens a new dialogue with the Name Khosravan and presages some of the political changes that Islamic rule experiences in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Dabashi invokes the notion of the Persian Prince, as I've just said, also as a rebel poet to connect these literary genres with the emergence of print journalism around the time of the Constitutional Revolution, 1906. He elaborates on the connections between Iran and the Caucasus and the fluid intellectual and geographic spaces that their artists occupied in that time. In this way, the Persian prince leaves his traditional abode, the royal court, and enters instead zones that are simultaneously claimed by different traditions. Professor Dabashi makes a case for trying also to de-ethnicize and de-gender the defining concept of the book, the prince. He argues that the Persian prince is an archetype whose identity transcends a specific gender or nationality, and we can perhaps debate this concept and this argument as a part of our roundtable. Still, his reinterpretation and rereading of the Shu'ubiyya movement is refreshing in that these concepts remain in dire need of new analytical frameworks. And this book can provide us with some of that moving forward and novel interpretations of that controversial moment. Professor Dabashi's notion of gender is also more complicated still. He recognizes the few renowned women of pre-Islamic and Islamic societies who served as sovereigns or as privileged women with political status. Then he points out that the political space itself becomes gendered as the nation assumes the shape of a woman in need of protection by its men. But the Persian prince adapts to the social peculiarities of the regions and the times. He is nomadic, polyglot, and moves through many spaces. In this way, the Persian prince breaks down these boundaries and becomes Afghan, Tajik, Iranian, and Pakistani as well. Professor Dabashi addresses the traditional aspects of statecraft and asks and tries to answer this fundamental question: how were Muslim empires held together? This is more toward the middle and the end of the book. Through some familiar mechanisms of rule, political legitimacy, justice, and even cruelty. Here, the influence of the Persian-speaking court is indelible, despite the universality of the concepts explored in key genres of political literature. We learn about the Persianate Alexander tracts that offer a melange of foreign and indigenous political exchanges. Toward the end of the book, Professor Dabashi subjects the Persian prince to colonial and Orientalist encounters. He discusses the Western discovery of the Shahnameh and its hero Rossam as the archetypal Persian prince of the era. He reads these works alongside Qajar recreations of the Persian prince in an era of Western colonial superiority. The manuscript thus, or the book thus, brings together a range of writings that originate in different eras and places. And it particularly, I think for me, it was very clever in the way that it addressed the national and ethnic tensions that terms such as Persian and Persianate naturally evoke when one first encounters the title. This enduring work offers an imaginative perspective on world literature through the analytical lens of the prince, a trope that is entirely unique and enables Professor Dabashi to travel seamlessly through antiquity, the early modern era, and the post-colonial period. But it does leave me with three questions that I'd like to very quickly raise. One is it possible truly to break out of the of the princely space? Is it possible truly to break out of, the privileged space of the prince, essentially? The prince also travels the world and still returns to Iran. The last part of the book brings us to Kiarostami. So I'm wondering, to what extent are these de-ethnicizing tendencies actually durable? The other question that I had was, patriarchy is also embedded in this idea of princehood. Why do we lack women archetypes? Is the Persian prince thus truly degendered? And then finally, how does the Persian prince appear in modern poetry? Thank you so much.
No snowball chance in hell that I can respond and reciprocate. First and foremost, with the generosity that you have read my book. More than anything else, it absolutely delights me that the book that, like all of us in all books, we sit down and write in solitude, or even if we are sitting in Pratt or something, we take our glasses off so we don't see the world, and is a solitary thing. That it has triggered 4 of my distinguished colleagues into their own respective realms. That they talk about my book, but the language and discourse and idiomaticity of their talking about my book comes entirely from the bosom of their respective scholarship. This is the most rewarding aspect of writing a book, that it is not specific to Iran specialist or Machiavelli specialist or thing. More than anything else, it is in this very room years ago when I had just started teaching Sisi and Litham, I was invited to talk by Jim Zetzel our colleague in the classics department, about the Quran. So I came and Jim said, today we were supposed to talk about Augustine, but we're going to talk about the Quran. And then he said, Hamid, of course, can talk about Augustine too. I said, yes, that is true, because I'm a colonial creature. I had to read Augustine. You didn't have to read the Quran. I had to read this. So in many ways, this book is the product of a mind that was born and raised and educated in a very specific moral, intellectual, political environment, but then went out. And as a result, the issue that Dabashi called from the book Cosmopolitan Worldliness is not just a conceptual category, it's a reality that can no longer, a book of this nature or any nature, remain insular about anything, that East is East, as the colonial poet was, and the West is West, and the two shall not meet. Well, in my book, they two actually meet. And they meet by virtue of the fact that instead of Michael Hart, who kindly and generously endorsed the book, said that Hamid's book both provincializes Machiavelli, but also enriches Machiavelli. The point is not to provincialize Europe, with all due respect, but historicize Europe and bring Europe into Mediterranean context, historical context. The reference, for example, to Makdisi that Pierre made, George Makdisi was my beloved teacher with whom I studied for 5 years. But as a Christian Lebanese scholar, his comparative perspective was directed towards Mediterranean world. And when you read his two absolutely magnum opus on colleges and humanism, he always compares and contrasts Islam and Christianity. Whereas for me, Christianity is, of course, is an issue, but it's not the entirely issue. The comparative is not just between Islam and Christianity. There's a larger frame of reference that allows you to travel. And what I found heuristically important about the concept is that I can go all the way to classical antiquity and come forward, and suddenly I'm watching Handel's Xerxes, and I see the same figure. And then I go to Indian context and Mahabharata and so forth. Again, the figure is there. Now, I'm going to just try to touch on some of the issues that my colleagues raised. The most sort of enduring thing that, to me, Dabashi said many important issues, is the question of Pari, the character of Pari, that appears in Indian cinema and can be a figure of archetypal authority in multiple ways. In Persian poetry, in Persian prose, and at least, in fact, talking Firuze about contemporary poet, as you know, the figure of Pari, Man Pari Kuchek Ghamgini ra mishnasam, appears in Furu Farrokhzad's poetry, and Pariyay Nazanin Chetun Zar Mizanin appears in the poetry of Ahmad Shamlu. So the figure of Pari or fairy appears multiple times, and also appears in folkloric literature in the 16th and 17th century. So one can indeed, as Dabashi suggests, sort of shift the frame of analysis away from the figure of Shahriyar or prince. We usually translate prince, principe as Shahriyar, into Pari, and sort of do a historiography or a genealogy of the figure of Pari. Now, what I mean by Dabashi, that the public sphere from which the figure emerges in the postcolonial period is gendered. It is by virtue of the presence of female revolutionary characters on that public sphere. The key example of the 19th century, as Firuze knows very well, is the figure of Tahir Ghurratul Ain. That she is not just a revolutionary figure, she genders the public sphere by virtue of her significance. Now, to jump to Pierre's point about humanism, he rightly points out two other critical. First of all, this is the most Italian book I have written. It's not just Machiavelli and Gramsci. It is also Rosi Braidotti, for whom I have immense respect and admiration of her work on posthumanism. But also Umberto Eco is there, and Calvino is. They're all. Somehow I'm in my Italian thingy. Now the thing from Ernst Cassirer that you noticed that I bring is Ernst Cassirer's book, The Myth of a State, which is 1946, after he had run away from Germany, was in Yale, and is the first posthumous book of his. The one issue that he raises, because of Nazism and the issue of fascism, Cassirer, does an entirely new reading of Eurocentric philosophical mind. What he says about Machiavelli, which is crucial, is that Machiavelli is not immoral, he is amoral. And it is in the amorality of the Machiavellian prose that the issue, for example, that Pierre brings forward, that for Machiavelli, the Ottomans are a modern contemporary dynasty, civilization. This is at a time that, as you know, Venetian and Ottoman rivalries have all sorts of manifestations, that the Safavids are entered. But conceptually and categorically, this is very different from looking at the Ottomans as the Oriental other. Now, the other issue that Pierre raises, namely humanism and post-humanism, and how I eventually go to Rumi's poetry, is in the work of Rosi Braidotti, she and others who are writing about post-humanism, they argue that the assumption that man is the measure of everything is now, given Anthropocene, and that we have destroyed the environment, is no longer valid. My argument is that the concept of man is the measure of everything is actually the European man is the measure of everything. So we have to localize and domesticate that concept of man. And then I sort of make a shift towards the fact that in Persian we don't have gender-specific pronoun, which is a miracle for understanding of how this works. Then I go to Rumi's famous poem in Masnavi, that it is not just human and animal, but actually is pre-animal and is vegetal, that he said we used to be vegetables and vegetables and flowers, and the reason that we love flowers during the spring is because we remember ourselves. And before that, even stones. So there are these inanimate things. So there is a trajectory from the inanimate all the way to human, animal and human, and then angelic, that in that trajectory, the possibility of humanism, as you rightly noted in my reading of Braidotti, is a fragmented conception of humanity, and also is de-Europeanized and de-Westernized and decolonized conception of humanity. And the same way that I collapse the category of prince into these formative forces of the poet and the thing, they're subcategories that they don't gel to come together. In fact, poets are at odds with each other. In contemporary Iranian history, I always identify Shariati as a prophetic voice and Shamlu as a poetic voice, but they are at odds with each other. It's not that they are sort of in cahoots in order to make the prince work. What else? So it is, I think what is the time? The agency, another issue that both Firuza and Pierre raise is the question of how agency is possible. Here, I do make a reference to Benjamin of relics and fragments and allegories in his posthumous book, the magnificent work of Susan Buck-Morse, in which she argues that probably when Benjamin was crossing Pyrenees, he had the complete text of the Passagenwerke, but disappeared and was lost. The issue of allegory as fragments or fragments as allegorical is paramount in my thinking of the collapse of the archetype. That the reason that the poet is authoritative or the rebel is authoritative, and as you recall, in the figure of the poet, I deliberately go outside Iran. I talked about Nazem Hekmat in Turkish context, Faiz Ahmad Faiz in Pakistani context, Mahmoud Darwish in Palestinian, Pablo Neruda, Mayakovsky, etc. That this fragmentation of the figure of the poet is not just poets who do in Persian. It can be any other poet. The poet itself has its roots in this category. So I think I've done more than my coupon. I'm going to stop. And once again, I'm extremely grateful to all of you for this rich. I wish I could just snatch your notes, take them, frame them, send them to the deans and the and presidents and all those people that think I'm a troublemaker on this campus, that I also do some good things. Thank you.
Thank you. I think as Hamid already said, the very fact that people have so many various responses is a real testament to the work. I think we are behind on time, but if we can open it up to a few questions. Joseph?
Yeah, thank you very much for, this is on? Yeah. Thank you very much for this presentation and these different responses that are very enriching, of course. One thing that was not discussed was actually Gramsci. We didn't speak about the modern period in a certain way. For me, I think what Gramsci does with Machiavelli is that he appropriates the love-fear sort of dyad that is ever present in El Principe. And what he does with that is transforms them into the modern technology of the state, hegemony and coercion. So hegemony becomes the way the state makes sure that it is loved through ideological control, and coercion is when that ideological control fails, right? And I think Gramsci is great this way because he undoes the liberal and even the social science division between so-called liberal democracy and dictatorship. They both become the same kind of regime. They just, use different amounts of coercion versus hegemony, and depending on the time of crisis. So given the fact that Antonio Gramsci's sort of deployment of Machiavelli is one of a continuing kind of an impersonal prince, meaning the state, how is that transformed into the rebel for you? This is something that was not clear to me in the presentation.
Excellent question. Thanks, Joseph. It is evident in the formation of the colonial and post-colonial state, not in the figures of the rebel poet, etc. The rebel and poet, my argument in the book is they are the constituent elements of the formation of the archetype at its formative period. That is Zoroaster, Muhammad, Cyrus. They're rebels. They begin as rebels. And then there is a poetic element in them, and obviously a prophetic element in them, and also an element of pilgrimage. So the collapse into these four categories is more in terms of oppositional figures to the transmutation, or as Pierre rightly said, metamorphosis of the state from the imperial into the republican or colonial, etc. The state inherits, as you rightly said, the definition of the prince from its classical context into the modern context. The state claims that, but transforms it, metamorphoses it. But meanwhile, my argument is that the archetype collapses and creates rebellious forms of resistance to that transmutation. And that resistance appears in these four categories that I said. So the categories are in the form of defiance and resistance, not inheriting that element. Hope that makes some sense. hope we didn't stun everyone.
I have another comment. I mean, I like Handel's Circes, and there was sort of a very interesting new production and recording some like maybe 18 years ago that I obtained at the time. But of course, also the figure of the pilgrim is important in that period of operatic Orientalism of the 18th century. Gluck, for example, writes Les Pèlerins de la Mecque, right, the pilgrims of Mecca. Gluck has all these very, very interesting, lesser-known Orientalist kind of operas versus what Mozart would do with Orientalism. And I was wondering if you dealt, with anything else besides Handel's.
In the body of the book, I have a whole section not only on opera but also on visual arts. But also visual art, not also in European art, also in Persian art, miniature and structurally, how the thing begins to collapse. And the work of Handel is, of course, very important, but it goes all the way to Schoenberg in contemporary music. And Mozart, of course, is the classical. Moses and Aaron, yes, Moses and Aaron. And Mozart, of course, is prototypical. But there, I have kind of a tacit conversation with our distinguished lead colleague, Edward Said, that the Orientalism of Mozart in Abduction from Seraglio is an Orientalism of rivalry and loathing, not an Orientalism of domination. So the Orientalism that Said, for example, talks about Aeschylus's Persian, that's Orientalism of Greeks sort of afraid of the Persians, is not an Orientalism of domination. And the Orientalism of Mozart in Abduction from Seraglio is a different kind of, because it's in opposition and hatred and fear of the Ottomans than, for example, what we see in 19th century travelogues. So and also paintings, there is a whole slew of paintings, depiction of Alexander, for example, and defeat of Darius III in the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire, and the eventual transformation of the figure of Alexander through Pseudo-Callisthenes in Persian and Arabic sources of the figure of Alexander, which appears in painting as well.
I tried to reference, but I was stumbling on my words, perhaps, that there is, I'm just looking at it, the transmutation of Machiavelli in the works of Gramsci, whose modern prince, participates in the creation of national will and power. So I think that, you sort of take it, you say it much more sort of emphatically, I guess.
Well, because in the prison notebooks, I think this is what he does, right? I mean, he already metamorphoses sort of the idea of love and fear of the ruler into hegemony and coercion, right? And
exactly.
So he undoes all this liberal framework of the so-called liberal democratic state versus the despotic state, and undoes the Orientalism of the Oriental despot that begins in the 18th century in a very interesting unifying framework of how the modern state actually functions, right? So the difference between a so-called totalitarian state and liberal democratic state really is just about the amounts of coercion versus the amounts of hegemony that they deploy, nothing more. They're not different types of regime, some of the political scientists or liberal ideology want us to believe, but actually the same type of regime, and they deploy them in different times. But so I think he does that less in the modern prince and more so in the prison notebooks, in a way where these ideas of Machiavelli are transposed sort of into a different register.
Yeah, I do agree, but I mean, I also think that, as Dabashi pointed out as well, that, there are so many, it ultimately comes down to the question of power, right? And I think that the Persian Prince, whatever manifestation of it, whether it's Modi, whether it's Trump, whether it's the state, ultimately it's about, how this idea of power gets sort of personified, either through a prince or a state, but usually through this idea of a great man, right? Like it's sort of like we haven't kind of moved away from this idea of looking at history and perhaps even societally looking for this, male savior.
Yeah, but you see, I'm thinking back, as Joseph rightly says, my attention to more the modern prince rather than other parts of the prisoner notebook has to do with the notion of political party, because political party does not have the same significance in our context as they did in the time of Gramsci in Italy. But again, for that attention, because I want to conceptually move back from political party to public sphere, because public sphere is the fertile ground and fertile space in which these categories in which I'm interested, namely variations on the theme of rebel and rebellion and a defiance of power. So I'm not, in this context, interested in the way you have the transmutation of the medieval prince into modern state, about which Joseph is absolutely right, but modes of resistance and defiance that dismantles that operation. In effect, theorizing these categories that are particularly important to me, the poet, the prophet, the thing, as modes of resistance, as modes of sort of engine of history that makes things move on, rather than being subjected to the transmutation of the state from a city state to a modern state.
And from the book, it seems that beside Gramsci's interpretation of Machiavelli across his works, because it's disseminated, they are more interested in Gramsci's use of Machiavelli's Prince as a metaphor.
Exactly.
And so from there you take
Exactly.
and you use it
Exactly.
as a tool.
Exactly. What I also write, Pierre, what you said, it is, I'm doing, in effect, a kind of epistemic violence to Gramsci, which replicates the epistemic violence that Gramsci did to Machiavelli, and allowing him to come and to speak to us today in a way that, perhaps they were not willing. So this is what I meant jokingly telling Gramsci, for whom I have, since my teenager years, immense admiration. I take it from here, brother, because he is sitting there and I'm kind of taking, as it were, and in fact, the metaphor of Dante with Gramsci and Machiavelli as my guide. I'm taking them to see, as Virgil and Beatrice, I'm taking them to see things in Iranian context, Islamic context, etc., but in terms that I borrow from their particular idiomaticity, but yet open up spaces that they would not have probably noticed. The argument being that what we need, again, as Pierre rightly said, Dabashi said, the issue is not provincializing Europe, but historicizing Europe. That's what we need to do. That's the best provincialization, historicization. So we don't have this huge metastasized metaphor that refuses to let go, called the West. The more you oppose it, the more powerful it becomes.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for all the commentaries. I wanted to ask whether there was a relationship, and I have to caveat this with not having read the entire book, so apologies if this is already covered, but with the notion of the subaltern in terms of the investigation of the kind of the modes of defiance and resistance, and in what ways somehow, I suppose, the notion that Gramsci himself gets from Dante, from his reading of Canto 10 of the Inferno, this idea, studying Cavalcanti, of the non-presence of the present, which he kind of takes from and develops from this in terms of trying to understand the subaltern as the kind of antipode of hegemony, and whether that speaks maybe to this idea of catharsis, of what the relationship of the possibility of catharsis of the subalterns is to the Persian Prince, and
yeah, at this stage, my concern is about subalternity is not, as Spivak says, sort of a non-political stratum, is actually conceptually and epistemically the elements and aspects of historiography that, again, as Dabashi and Pierre said, that are not part of the conversation. Namely, when you're talking about European intellectual history or classical antiquity or Hebrew Bible, etc., there is a bizarre kind of fetishism that people who talk about Hebrew scholarship, they are willing to talk about Mesopotamian culture, but they don't go near the Quran. It's just bizarre. So the Quran is the subaltern of biblical studies. As has been argued before, the chapter on Mary is one of the Gospels, the fifth Gospel. You can put the fourth Gospel, and the chapter on Mary is the fifth Gospel. But it's just bizarre that nobody goes near the Quran. It's just this psychotic fear. So subalternity to me at this stage is simply to bring into conversation and consciousness, which could be a reading of Spivak, consciousness, the fact that there is a form of evidence and material, as what Pierre was just saying, in terms of Ottomans being a modern state for Machiavelli. This is the conceptual subalternity, theoretical subalternity, historical consciousness subalternity, that then allows us to sort of help build, as we just all did, build a category called the Persian Prince or Arab Prince or Turkish Prince is not a particular. I mean, I see Firuza's point that ultimately this is a Persian Prince so far as the material with which I'm working. But theoretically, it is possible to call it any prince. The subalternity would be to try to bring into the archive just what you're now doing with Edward's archive. Try to bring into archive the repressed, denied, denigrated, demonized aspects of world regional history, Mediterranean world, that that then historicizes the idea of Europe, and as a result bring the subaltern subconscious to consciousness and sort of begin to think of a global history, regional history, Mediterranean history, that all of this thing that you see happening around us is no longer, I mean, violently is possible, militarily is possible, but when the officials in Israel say what we are doing is defense of Western civilization, is to say this is precisely right. The history of savagery is the history of Western civilization. So you're doing that. So in order to overcome that, you need to have a different historical consciousness. This I owe entirely, I must always say, to George Makdisi and his exquisite scholarship. But again, as I said, as a Christian, I have to think about present company included, Christian scholars of Islam, Arab scholars of Islam. There is a very particular aspect to that. George Makdisi, Joseph Mas'ad, Wael Hallab. You have a book on Islam. Yeah, Edward Said. At any rate, so the point is that, yeah, I think I said it. We'll talk more.
I mean, what is the etymology of, what is the word for prince in Persian?
Shahriyar. Yeah.
In Arabic, it's Amir meaning commander.
Yes, yes, that's Arabic, which is
And European language prince is first, first primary.
yeah, but in Persian it's Shahriyar, Shahr meaning cosmos, and Yar means master or patron, etc. Right, Firuze?
It is like Amir.
Yeah, Amir
does
as
have
well.
the same
Yeah.
connotation.
But I think it's from Khabar, like Hebrew commands, or gives orders, right?
Yeah.
Order or something.
I mean, yeah, but I mean, a Shahriyar is someone, who's,
Yeah.
Who commands as well, I guess.
commands a city or,
Yeah.
I think it's very similar.
Exactly like Arabic, as you know. In Persian, we have to have a poem. Shahriyaran budo, jay mehbanan in diyar. This is Hafiz. Shahriyaran ra che pish amad, Shahriyaran ra che shud. So they play with Shahr, which means city or a state at the same time, and Yar, which means patron or in charge or friend, etc. combined becomes Shahriar. And the book, the Prince, Machiavelli, has been translated as Shahriar.
I was just going to say, you also do gesture in your book, on page 175. You do talk about how the genre of the epic takes us to new sort of forms of reading and decolonial experiences in Latin America and Africa.
Oh,
So,
yes.
Yeah, I thought that was really very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so happy when there is a page 175 in something.
Well, it's that Germanic tradition of footnoting,
Yeah, exactly.
being very
I
precise.
must say, I didn't know that Firuzeh was a stellar scholar of Iran. Was one of my blind readers. I didn't know. The book is there in part because of Firuzeh.